Hi, everyone. I'm Jessica Sachare, and welcome to Higher Ed Matters. I'm here today with the leaders of our creative team, Jody and Brent, and we wanted this episode or this discussion to sort of talk more about the practicality of a brand, like the practical application. You guys delve into college brands and work with them and interpret them on a daily basis. So we thought we would kind of just talk about how we navigate institutional brands, how you both from the creative design and the creative writing aspects work with them to develop kind of compelling campaigns and kind of where brand and brand guidelines kind of intersect and how they can be both a help and maybe sometimes a hindrance. So we can't define, or we could, but we don't want to define what brand is today. But what is a brand guideline, and what does it represent to an agency that's or a freelancer or anyone that's like using that brand guideline? What is that tool?
So I think at its essence, a brand guideline is a guide that sets out some standards that you are wanting anybody who's working with your brand to follow. Generally, it covers things like the look and feel, everything from typography to color palettes to the way that you want to use photography and imagery, or things like texture, overlays, patterns, if your brand has them. It also dives into oftentimes tone and voice, and how you speak about yourself as an institution and your storytelling. And you can have, one page on each of these things, or you can have 10 pages on each of these things. But at the crux of it is a foundation for your brand look, feel, and storytelling opportunities.
Yeah, and I know from my freelancing days, like sometimes, not always, it sometimes felt limiting, right? Because I would want to create these new ideas, these kind of fresh ideas, and oftentimes I'd be handed this brand guideline, and I couldn't say something a certain way. Jody and I've had some really good conversations about this because oftentimes with our clients, they come in with this sort of packaged up brand already that maybe they've used for a year or two, maybe it's already established, maybe it's gone back, and we've even worked with some that have not changed their brand or brand guidelines in a decade. So sometimes, and creating a whole new brand is a completely different exercise than expanding on an existing brand.
Right.
And so Jody and I will have a lot of conversations about how we dig in and we kind of begin to understand the existing brand so that we can begin to send that out into the world in new and different ways, right? We are creatives, and so we do have to get creative with it. We can't just completely stick to what the existing brand is.
Mm-hmm.
How do you take a brand and, like Brent said, like how do you learn it and then think about the task at hand and what we are charged with doing, which is usually some sort of recruitment effort,
Right.
and think about the specific audience that needs to be spoken to in whatever tactics that we're doing, and think about how the brand does or does not fit those tactics. And that can really depend, how easy that is to do. It really depends sometimes on, how robust the brand guidelines are, how, like you said, how long ago they may have been created and how ready they are for maybe more modern or digital types of applications. If the brand guidelines they cover all sorts of things, or if they cover a very slim subset. Sometimes, we are presented with a brand guideline that is really just typed up ideas in a Word document. And then we have clients who have 100-page brand guidelines that have been put together in an incredibly robust way by their agency of record, that have like a ton of stipulations and ideas. So we really have to navigate these very different experiences before we can even jump into our projects.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you use a great word that's like navigate, right? Like how do we sort of find our way through to meet sort of the each of those audiences, right? That they're trying to recruit. And also, how do we navigate anything that's occurring culturally at the time? Or, we've talked about this, like with the pandemic and how that affects the thinking of students that you're trying to recruit. So I think it is important to have, these conversations, because we know that we have to, not only do we have to sort of to make sure the client feels like they're being heard, right? we have to make sure that the students they're trying to recruit want to listen. And I think that that's an important thing to keep in mind. There's a lot of audiences that you're dealing with at different levels.
Yeah, I think that like at first glance, you get brand guidelines and you look at them and go, oh man, like this is all I can do. But that's really not the best way to think about them. You think about a little bit about like who are your brand guidelines made for? Well, your brand guidelines are made for anybody who is going to be using your brand and reaching out into the world. And you want to kind of set some baseline expectations for what that's going to look like and feel like. And your brand guideline is going to do that for you so that regardless of it's a somebody on working for alumni or it's going to be one of your student groups, everybody's reaching out with the exact same idea. However, instead of thinking about it being limiting, as from a creative perspective, I like to think of it as like the foundation from which to build, because you don't necessarily want to start doing things that are so far away from the brand guideline that you get into this realm of off-brand. Right. But at the same time, it's not that what you see in the brand guidelines is the only thing that you're able to create or make. We were talking a little bit earlier about how whoever came up with your brand guidelines, regardless of how small or big they are, they did not have a crystal ball, that they could not possibly foresee every instance that you would need to be able to use in the future. Like they weren't necessarily thinking across every tactic, every campaign, every instance where you're going to have to go out and speak to people and connect with people. So they were trying to put a framework around how to think about doing that. So we oftentimes will get into these discussions or when we're presenting stuff to our clients where is something that we're presenting within the structure of their brand guides. And some people are like, well, I don't see that in here. So how can you do that? Mm-hmm. And then you have to have this discussion around, well, what is this purpose of this guide? And what is the purpose of the campaign? And it kind of explaining and speaking through and having the conversations around why it's a great foundation, but it's not always the be all end all of who your brand is, how it evolves, what it becomes, and how you use it to create creative.
Really, if the core brand typically kind of lacks on its own a personality of its own, right? Like it's not there's so much that goes into the campaign that is developed out of the brand, both in messaging and in design, that really gives the brand life.
One of the things I love about my job is that I can take an existing brand that may just, or a tagline that's 3 words, and then sort of filter all that through these different like audiences they're trying to reach and find really cool and fun ways to say that tagline or reimagine that brand in a way that is going to appeal to the particular audience, right? And I think that's the fun part. So I think you're right. Like, let's not look at it as limiting. There's back in the day I did. I don't really anymore. I really see it now as this sort of flexible, opportunity to take something that is very personal to the school and to the people that created the brand, but make it personal to the audience, right? Like that's, I think that's probably one of the more challenging parts of the job, but it's also one of the most exciting parts of the job as well.
So a good example of that is we just went through a concepting exercise for a university, and their brand guidelines is one of those less robust ones. It is a one-sheeter, like a long-form one-sheeter. It's probably, like very vertical. But this one-sheeter basically just has, here's our font, here's our colors, here's a little bit of information about like our logos and our seal, but that was it. And their brand colors were just 2 colors. So when we were trying to think about how do we create a really interesting and dynamic suite of collaterals for them, what does that look like? And how can you do that with potentially just 2 colors? Well, we ended up putting together 3 different concepts that use that color palette and their fonts in different ways. But the one that we actually netted out on going with, in conjunction with the school picking this one, was a concept that used their colors as the foundation for a set of gradients. So we were able to have, actually orange was one of their colors, and one of the gradients was red to orange to yellow. And then this navy blue was another color, and we ended up having this turquoise to kind of like a periwinkle to the navy. So we were able to create this really robust, dynamic aesthetic without having to stray too far away from their brand, but it took their brand, kind of took it to a new space, made it more exciting and engaging, especially since the audience was a younger first-time college student audience. And we really wanted to push it, but not push it so far that it didn't feel like them.
And I know who you're talking about, and I really,
I would hope.
and what was fun about that one was that the language that that sort of I came up with matched the idea of. So we use a lot of like open language, welcoming language, freedom, like free kind of language that mirrored the design work that you were doing. And so I think that's a fun way to do it too. So sometimes you can take the visually the brain and really kind of play with it, right? But then you can also let the language sort of follow behind that, or vice versa, which is always a fun part of the job.
And I think that actually brings me like to think about something that's really important, because I know we're sitting here talking about, well, you have this brand guidelines and this foundation, and we're sitting here like talking about how to push it, but I think that you need to talk about a little bit like what are the instances where it's right to push it, and thinking about that we have this story that we're going to tell, and it comes to life through the words and it comes to life through the art, that we have rationale behind the reason for straying away a little bit from the foundation of their brand. And it's important not to just let everybody willy-nilly stray away from the foundation of your brand, but maybe it's your agency of record, or your marketing people, who just anybody who truly knows and works within your brand regularly and understands it needs to have like a good reason with strong rationale and a compelling argument for why you're going to be straying away from what is set in the foundation.
What are those core pieces of a brand that makes you or helps you to walk the line between going off brand or pushing the brand, right? Like how were you able to, in this case with the university concept that you were discussing, how were you able to push it, use those colors, but also not get into a space where it didn't feel like them anymore?
So it's a great question. I think that like one of the things that I like to think about is how many different facets of a campaign are there in terms of like the language, in terms of the colors, in terms of the typography, in terms of the photography, and how many of those can you change before it feels off-brand? Right. So thinking about this one project and the 3 concepts that we put together, in one of the concepts, we actually introduced a secondary font. Well, the school only had a sans serif font as their main brand font, and the concept that the first concept that we put together really had this romantic, not like romantic in a lovey sense, but like romanticized. If you think about, Brent, you're the words guy.
I mean, it was kind of like this love letter type of language, but it wasn't a romantic love.
Not like Valentine's Day,
like
romantic.
More like like an art type of.
Yeah, there you go, like romantic art type of feel. And their brand font was great for body copy and legibility and headlines, but it really didn't bring this sense of romance that we wanted to the piece. So we kept the colors very traditional in terms of like what their guideline was, but we treated the photography, doing a mix of black and white and overlays and full color, and pairing that with this like this serif font that we brought in to bring some of that romanticism and that texture to the page. So you keep some elements the same and introduce some other elements, so you're not always straying too far away from the foundation of it. Whereas the one with the gradients, we actually didn't change their font use, but we did play with their color use and thinking about how the gradients could amp up their use of color. And then in the third concept that we put together, it was actually using their 2 colors and only those 2 colors, with white and black as accents and everything, but those 2 colors and a very specific photographic treatment that was graphic and dynamic and really pushed the photography angle to a new place and imbued the photography with their colors. So it's not thinking about like how far away do I stray from what they do. It's thinking about how do I take what they have and start to use that in new creative ways to create different looks and feels that still feel on brand.
Mm-hmm.
I'm always thinking about audience, right? Like in who the audience is, and it's not always, rarely is it just one audience, right? Like you're if we're talking about, we work with several community colleges. So in these cases, working with community college is different than working with a traditional university, because with a community college, they're not only, you have the audience of, yes, the traditional student, but you also have high school students that you're talking to. You have older adults, for adult education course. You have the community itself who relies on the community college, right, as a resource for all kinds of events that are occurring on campus, and so you always need to be thinking about how does the existing brand, how does that filter through the pain points and what we call like the wow moments of prospective students, or stakeholders. And I think that it's really important that just because a brand exists doesn't mean it can't be flexible, and it needs to be flexible to meet the needs, the rapidly changing needs of students a lot of times, right? Like that, particularly as we talked about earlier, like in with big things happening in the world, students are choosing or not choosing to go to college is based on sometimes the things that are happening around them in their communities, in their neighborhoods. So you need to find a way to translate a brand so that it speaks directly to each one of those individual audiences. And like I said, that's kind of, I see it kind of the brand is overarching, but all this stuff is falling through it, and it's like filtering out these audiences that we have to explore. That's why I love in cases where we do projects where we have a lot of good research, right? And we're able to like reach into some surveys and figure out like what the students are thinking and why they're choosing or not choosing to go to a particular school. And then we can build out a messaging strategy from there. And then, that messaging strategy can help to sort of alleviate a lot of the fears that clients may have about how their brand is being translated.
I think that's really important to think about, because if you've done the research and you have a really clear understanding of like the what, the why, and how you want to connect with people, then when you push the brand a little bit, it is based in that research. So that the heart of what you're doing is going to be correct. And that gives you a little bit more flexibility in playing with the look and feel and the tone and the branding, because that at the end of the day, it's all circling around the same goal that you've done the research on and are working towards. And I think your point about audiences is just something we could probably talk about all day, but like dig into a little bit more here too, because I think that interpreting a brand, and going back to the fact that, there's no crystal ball and they can't think of every instance that you're going to use your brand. The audience is a great way for people internally to start thinking about, how do we think about our brand, and how do our different audiences want to see or might interpret the pieces that we're putting out based on our brand guidelines. So if you are putting out a piece from your foundation or to your alumni, that's a very different audience than your incoming students, your prospective students at a traditional university. Prospective students, obviously, if you're a community college, your prospective students are all kinds of people. But then how do you speak to all the different kinds of people? A good example, speaking of community colleges, we were working on a website project for a client recently, and we were tasked both with thinking about redoing the look and feel of their EDU site, so their main site, as well as putting together kind of a microsite, a supplemental digital view book that was going to be more recruitment, prospective audience based, because their EDU site has so many audiences, from just the different students to the community to the theater, and people just wanting to find tickets to the events that they hold on campus, and people having to have a wedding venue. That is so different than just a recruitment-based audience for prospective students. So they have a palette that has, grays and whites and blues and pops of yellow. But for the EDU site, we really leaned more into this collegiate feel, which is clean and white, and was, I don't want to say less fun, but it was more pulled back than in terms of what we're proposing for the digital view book, which is a little bit more exciting, engaging, and is supposed to get people interested and really feel like they're excited about the opportunity to become a student. From a student perspective, if you are a well-known institution, the students probably know you, and they have some preconceived notions, which sometimes we're making pieces to like break those notions, but they know who you are. There's a solid foundation of learning of resources. They know that you exist, and they want to come there for sometimes that reason. Whereas if you are maybe a newer school or even a newer program within an established institution, you have to tell your story a little bit differently, that considers the brand a little bit differently, especially if it's a new brand.
I think what you're saying is totally true. Like in terms of maybe not a new college, like a brand new college, but colleges and universities do go through these major rebrands, every whatever, maybe 5, 10, 12 years or whatever.
The average brand lasts for like 7 to 8 years.
Higher ed, they hang on to it for a little longer. but yeah, so there's these big rebrands that happen, and it does make sense that when you do an institutional level rebrand, that you are maybe a little tighter on the guideline. Like you're really trying to make sure that people can make that brain switch, that recognized the old brand to this new brand. But as you go along, once that is established, again, with using research to make sure that the awareness has grown, then you can start to maybe develop fresh takes on what that brand is. It does give you the opportunity to catch the eye of someone that didn't notice you before, right? I think that's where the marketing piece of the marketing side of the brand, can really be fun, and it can be less serious than your institutional or your core brand has to be.
You just hit on something really good in thinking about like if you are starting with a newer brand that you're launching or a fresh take on something, when do you start to reevaluate? And like, what does that look like? And how do you approach that? This is fresh on our minds because just really recently we have a client who has had this core brand for a number of years now, and that they work with a few different agencies, and we are one of those agencies, and we have personally felt that like there's some things that when we put together ideas, it's like there's pushback on like, well, is this on brand? But we've discovered through some of our conversations with our clients that there are other agencies are feeling the same way, including the agency that created the original brand. Right. And this is just a natural evolution of we had these tight reins on the brand, but as we're getting into speaking to different audiences and thinking about how this brand comes to life across a huge spectrum of things that they're doing, like, is it limiting? So we really recently got together and had kind of like a summit with the marketing team, the admissions team, and representatives from each of the agencies to kind of put our like thinking hats on and talk through some of those pain points and some of those like instances where we wanted to push something. We brought together examples of like where this is something we proposed but it got turned down, or how would we as different agencies wanted to interpret things, and started just kind of like talking about like, well, what is the limits to pushing it? Where do we feel like that there's more free for all? Where do we feel like we kind of want to hold on to the reins to that? Who has the ability to think more flexibly this way? Is it anybody at the school? Or is it just, this is something that we're reserving for your agencies who, really know and understand your brand, but have these instances where they need to be able to push it for those specific audiences in most cases. So it was just a great conversation. And I think it's really important to have these conversations because at the end of the day, now marketing, admissions, and all three agencies are going to be on the same page.
In that case, in that opportunity to discuss the brand, I guess it's probably 8 or 10 years old, maybe the brand, allows you to maybe not have to invest in the full-on rebrand exercise, right? But can you push the edges a little bit of the brand as it was to still maintain, like, again, not have to redo, like tear down and rebuild a university brand, but have a new lens with which to view it through.
Pull the thread on it a little bit and see what happens.
That's a great way to think about it too, because oftentimes a whole rebrand is maybe not needed or not in the budget, but thinking about how you could refresh what you have and look at it a little bit differently, or play with some aspects of it, or see maybe what's missing from it in terms of how to like just push it in a bit of a new direction to open up that flexibility and to give it a little bit more breathing room creatively. Again, with the stipulation of not like just letting it go bonkers where like now you don't have an actual brand anymore that's recognized, but thinking about it in a structured way that allows your structure to be a little more unstructured.
Sure. Speaking of creating concepts and brands. I believe you guys have a creative workshop that you have to get to. But thank you so much for joining. Yes. Oh, pizza.
Yes, pizza first.
Pizza, then create. Thank you so much for joining me for today.
Thanks.
All right.
Good conversation.